Ever since the 2016 presidential campaign, it seems like fact-checking got really cool. Almost every major US outlet is doing it now. It's become so prevalent that even Teen Vogue is fact-checking Donald Trump. And you know teens know what's cool. But political fact-checking journalism began long before 2016. It began in 2003 with FactCheck.org. PolitiFact began during the presidential campaign in 2007. The Washington Post fact-checker started at the same time in 2007, and it became a permanent feature at the Washington Post in 2011 under my editor, Glenn Kessler. Like I said, I joined in 2014. The Washington Post fact-checker, FactCheck.org, PolitiFact, we're the big three of the political fact-checking movement. In recent years, interest in political fact-checking has exploded around the globe. In 2010, there were just 4 fact-checking organizations, and 3 of them were in the United States. Now, there are nearly 120 fact-checking organizations in 47 countries. It turns out that voters in many countries want to hold politicians accountable for their statements and their promises. People often ask me what it's like to be a fact-checker. My answer is very simple. I practice fundamental journalism. I ask questions, and I try to get as many answers as I can. I hold the powerful accountable for what they say to the public, who voted them into office and pay their salaries. I reveal when they silently switch positions on policy matters without disclosing it to the public. I shed light on their falsehoods and their misleading rhetoric. If I wanted to be more dramatic, I might quote the Washington Post's new slogan, "Democracy dies in darkness." For some reason, it's really controversial. A lot of people don't like that slogan, but I really like it. I realized my passion for accountability journalism early in my career. My first full-time job at age 22 was in Arizona, covering a corruption-ridden local government. The politicians were all suing each other over politics, draining public money, and spinning reporters about their side of the story. There was a lot at stake. Media coverage in their favor would help their lawsuits, as in their payouts. To be impervious to their spin, I had to be armed with facts and public records at all times. Naturally, my beat got absorbed into the investigative team. And from that point on, I decided that this was what I wanted to do for the rest of my career, holding the powerful accountable, holding accountable the politicians who are not living up to their actions and their words. That's what I do at Washington Post Fact Checker. Let me now tell you about our role, our process, and our experience fact-checking the 2016 elections and, of course, President Donald Trump. Politicians and interest groups use facts and figures to bolster their arguments to advance their policies. They're kind of like salesmen. And just like you would not buy a used car without checking under the hood, you should not accept what a politician says to advance his or her policy preferences without checking out the facts. That's the rationale behind the Washington Post Fact Checker. We're a team of 3. 2 of us are reporters, and we have a video editor who produces video fact checks. We focus on claims that are newsworthy and ones that provide us an opportunity to dig deeper into matters of public policy, domestic or international. We are a public service, and our mission is to help our readers become critical and skeptical readers of the news. That's why about 50% of what we fact check comes from reader inquiries. Of course, sometimes newsworthiness outweighs our desire to present a policy discussion. For example, the day after Inauguration Day, President Trump and his press secretary made wildly inaccurate claims that the crowd at inauguration was the largest in the history of inaugural speeches. This was so easily proven false using photos and TV and online viewership data. It's not exactly a matter of policy, domestic or international, but it's important because it was the first mendacious act by the new administration, which was about 24 hours old at that time. At least 5 days a week, we take a detailed look at a politician's statement and examine the facts behind that claim. Our methodology is a standard one among independent fact-checking organizations. The burden of proof is on the speaker. So once we decide to investigate a claim, we contact the politician's staff and we ask them for the data that back up the claim. And then we do our own independent research and reporting. We pay great attention to the source of their claims. That is, if they send the source of the claims, sometimes they don't. We look at which group did that study that the politician might be citing or using, what political connections that group might have, and who's funding them. If it's a claim about guns and the research comes from a pro-gun or anti-gun lobby, that immediately raises red flags for us. For example, to explain why Hillary Clinton lost to Trump in Wisconsin by about 20,000 votes, Democrats now claim that the voter identification law in Wisconsin reduced turnout by about 200,000 votes. But this claim is based on one widely criticized study that doesn't actually support the argument. And the study was commissioned by, guess who? The main liberal organization that funded Clinton's campaign. The researchers also refused to share their data publicly, which was also a red flag for us. The good news is there are independent government agencies whose purpose is to conduct nonpartisan analyses of legislation, the federal budget, and government programs. We rely on those reports and other reports by auditors and inspectors general whose job it is to watchdog the government. We lean on experts to provide context. There's an expert for everything, no matter how narrow or obscure the topic. You just have to get creative and look hard enough for the right person to talk to. And these experts are important because they help us authoritatively speak to the facts that we're fact-checking. And of course, we rely on archives and other public records. After we examine all the facts, we make a ruling ranging from 1 to 4 Pinocchios on how truthful the statement is. Our Pinocchio ratings are like reverse restaurant reviews. You know how on Yelp, if you have 5 stars, it's a good restaurant, 1 star is bad? It's the opposite. For statements that are surprisingly true, we issue a rating called the Geppetto checkmark. But that's reserved for rare occasions. 1 Pinocchio is selective telling of the truth, some omissions and exaggerations, but no outright falsehoods. For instance, Democrats often assert that women earn 79% as much as men, or 79 cents to the dollar, as they put it. That's a statistic from the Census Bureau, so that's a legitimate source. But that's just one of many ways to measure this problem, and it happens to be the worst. Differences in the life choices of men and women make it difficult to make simple comparisons like that. If you adjust for various factors, the gap is not 21 cents, but it could be as little as 5 cents. 2 Pinocchios means significant omissions and/or exaggerations. Some factual error may be involved, but not necessarily. A politician can create a false or misleading impression by playing with words and using legalistic language that means little to ordinary people. For example, whenever there's a terrorist attack involving gunmen, Democrats always return to the debate over whether known or suspected terrorists should be able to buy guns. They say their proposal in Congress would ban gun sales for people on the no-fly list, thereby closing a loophole. The popular catchy phrase they use is, and you may have heard this, if you're too dangerous to board a plane, you're too dangerous to buy a gun. But what Democrats don't say is that their proposal would not ban such purchases automatically, and the bill is not directly tied to the no-fly list. Instead, it would give authority to the Department of Justice to decide whether or not a suspected terrorist could buy a gun. So it actually gives more discretion to the Department of Justice and doesn't necessarily close a no-fly loophole. 3 Pinocchios is significant factual error and/or obvious contradictions. So this is when things get increasingly disconnected from reality. For example, during the primary debates in 2016, Texas Senator Ted Cruz said that studies by the US Marines found that, quote, putting women in combat ended up increasing casualties both among the women and among the men, unquote. Actually, the studies said that women were more prone to injuries on the job, But that was because, partly because the type of task that that unit was responsible for actually led to more injuries among the Marines in general. It also said that women used creative problem solving to overcome their reduced height and weight. And it said nothing about the presence of women and the impact on casualties within that unit. So Ted Cruz completely twisted the results of the study for political purposes. 4 Pinocchios is for Whoppers. And frankly, that's just about everything Donald Trump says these days. Every politician says something worthy of 4 Pinocchios at some point. And it's maybe 1 or 2 times out of every 10 rulings that we give. During the campaign, Hillary Clinton earned 4 Pinocchios 15% of the time, which is typical of the politicians we fact check. For Donald Trump, he earned 4 Pinocchios 65% of the time. Hillary Clinton was quite calculated with her words. As a trained lawyer and a longtime politician, she sometimes used such legalistic and oblique language that it was difficult to decipher what she was really saying. Her claims, like most politicians, were in the 2 to 3 Pinocchio range, often lacking context or using technical language that obscured the truth. Many of Clinton's 3 to 4 Pinocchio ratings during the campaign were due to her series of misleading statements about her private email server arrangement when she was Secretary of State. Among other claims, she falsely said the arrangement was permitted, that she had not sent or received classified information, and that the FBI director had said that her answers were truthful. Every politician bends the truth, but Trump takes it to a whole new level. He makes false and misleading claims so frequently and flip-flops on so many policy matters that it's really hard to keep up. The list of misstatements is endless. He said that he watched thousands of Muslims in New Jersey cheer the fall of the World Trade Center. When we looked into it, we found no TV footage, no newspaper coverage, just scattered, unconfirmed reports of 5 or 6 people celebrating, and not necessarily Muslim. He said that the wives of the 9/11 attackers were sent home from the United States before the attacks. Only one attacker was married, and his wife never visited the United States. He claimed there were 92 million jobless Americans, but that included everyone who was not looking for work, like retirees and high school students. So it doesn't tell you anything about the unemployment rate or the unemployment problem. He claimed that he predicted Osama bin Laden would attack the United States before 9/11, but he made no such prediction. He even claimed that he would save $300 billion a year from a federal prescription drug program that only costs $78 billion a year. Trump's pattern of falsehoods and misleading claims continues in his presidency. He falsely says millions of undocumented immigrants voted in the election, just enough to give him the edge in the popular vote. But there's no evidence to back up this claim. Yet using this false claim as justification, he has now set up a presidential commission on voter fraud, even though voter fraud is extremely rare in the United States. Trump's announcement that he was pulling the United States out of the Paris Agreement on climate change was full of misleading claims. Even though each country sets its own commitments to reduce carbon emissions, he said that the deal treats the US unfairly and he's going to negotiate a fairer deal. He said research shows that the Paris Agreement only reduces 0.2 degrees Celsius. And he said tiny, tiny amount at the press conference. He did this and citing this statistic. Therefore, he argued that the Paris Agreement was not effective. But the author of that report told me that Trump took his research totally out of context. The point of the research was the opposite, that the Paris Agreement is one step out of many more incremental steps that the international community needs to take. At the Washington Post, we have been keeping careful track of his statements. As of Monday, which was Trump's 151st day in office, we have counted 669 false or misleading statements. That's just since Inauguration Day. And it's not unique claims, it's repeat claims as well. We're also tracking his promises through our Trump Promise Tracker, which we update when Trump has launched, compromised on, or broken a campaign promise. We acknowledge that Pinocchios are a bit of a marketing gimmick. It's not perfect, it's not scientific, and it's open to subjective analysis. The line between 2 and 3 Pinocchios is sometimes fuzzy, but it's a useful way to distill our analysis in a consistent manner that readers can easily understand. We aim to be as transparent and consistent as possible in our rulings. If we're stuck between a 2 and 3 Pinocchios, we'll lay out all the factors that we're considering, and we'll tell the readers which factors tipped us down to a 2 or up to a 3. At the Fact Checker, we've also been using alternative story formats to reach new audiences in an effort to be innovative and engaging with our readers and viewers. Our new video editor is producing high-quality video fact checks that are easy to consume. During the campaign, my fact checks on Snapchat, which I called Snap Checks, had the highest engagement among all political stories on the Washington Post Snapchat account. I write the weekly Fact Checker newsletter, which is among the most popular and fastest growing newsletters at the Washington Post. We consistently find that our newsletter grows through people who signed up after someone else forwarded the email to them, which is a really good sign because peer-to-peer recommendations like that are key to building audience trust. The appetite for fact checks is greater than ever. In fact, we've seen an outpouring of support for accountability journalism in general. Yet, public distrust in journalists and mainstream media outlets remains high. Of course, it is troubling that the president routinely calls media coverage he doesn't like as fake news, when there are people who actually profit off of stories that they literally create out of nothing. And this has basically rendered the term fake news meaningless. But it also doesn't help that a lot of journalists now move too quickly to break news online or to make the first snarky comment on Twitter without double-checking their facts or without correcting their errors. I firmly believe that the best way to earn and maintain readers' trust is to be fair and transparent and quick to acknowledge and correct our errors. There are some people who are just never going to trust us, for whatever personal reason. There are people who will accept 100% what a politician says, whether they're a Democrat or a Republican. But I've encountered plenty of skeptical readers who appreciate that we're tough on both sides, and for that reason, they tell us that they read us and they subscribe to us. We must show that we are agnostic to the party or political views of those we hold accountable. For example, I write a lot of fact checks about abortion, which is a debate that's largely driven by emotions, not by facts. I've fact-checked just about every pro and anti-abortion talking point that I've come across in the past 2.5 years. Anti-abortion advocates are consistently surprised that I reach out to them to understand their rhetoric and their data. And some pro-abortion groups have stopped talking to me because they think I'm being too critical of them. I view this as a clear product of the narrative that mainstream news outlets have a liberal bias. And I hope that I'm challenging that narrative by showing that my only bias is toward the truth. One of the questions I was asked to address was, how do you measure success? Quantitatively, it's easy. Our fact checks are reaching more people than ever, and our audience continues to grow. In October of 2016, the month before the election, Fact Checker reached its record traffic. In January 2017, we doubled that traffic. Qualitatively, I'm not so sure. We don't aim to change politicians' behaviors, and it's up to voters to decide what to do after reading our fact checks. Of course, when a politician suddenly drops a talking point or revises a talking point after we gave them Pinocchios, we hope that our fact check has something to do with it. But what I do know is that digging, revealing the facts, holding the powerful accountable, and enlightening readers about the behaviors of their elected leaders is always a worthwhile endeavor for the public and our democracy, regardless of who's president. To put it simply, it's our job. So even though fact-checking seems much cooler in the Trump era, to me, it will always be a cool thing to do. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
investigative magazine here in the UK, and I'm just interested in what we are very specialist in what we do, writing about the health service in the UK, and we will often write in much more detail than maybe our colleagues in the national media. And I'm just interested in your thoughts about this, because you're doing a very cool job fact-checking, and it sounds great, and we've seen similar things done here with the BBC doing that, etc. But I just wonder, you said at the beginning you practice fundamental journalism, and I wonder if we farm out fact-checking to a specific group of a member of a team within a newsroom, are we maybe allowing other journalists in the same newsroom to be less robust in their fact-checking when they're reporting daily news and publishing it as we always have? Isn't this something we should all be doing, and we shouldn't have a dedicated, not wanting to put you out of a job, but I'm just interested in your reflections on that.
Sure. Yes, everybody should be fact-checking, and it's not like fact-checking is this really special thing that only two people do in the newsroom. You know, everyone does it. Our fact checks should be a supplement to other coverage in the newsroom. We're a part of the politics team, and we work very closely with all the beat reporters who see these facts or untruths being spoken at press conferences or in interviews, and they'll tell us, you know, hey, you might want to look into this. For beat reporters, it's important for them to have access, so they might not be able to have the same type of scrutiny that we're able to provide in a more independent way. We don't have sources that we're burning on a beat if we're criticizing them and calling them out. I do believe that everyone within the news organization should be doing what we're doing, but sometimes they don't always have the resources. They don't have the time to spend, 2 days looking into one statistic like we do. So we're able to work with the reporters in our newsroom to provide extra level of scrutiny in their coverage. And when we see something that they're quoting, we'll let them know and say, hey, we fact checked this, you might want to add this and show that it's not actually true. But I have seen more reporters feeling comfortable with just fact checking within the article. And that's something that we've seen since the campaign, particularly with Donald Trump. And if he says something that's so not accurate, it's incumbent on the reporters to point that out within their article. So we're seeing this movement away from he said, she said, to actually fact checking within the article, whether they're embedding our fact checks as a link in the article where it needs to be, or they'll say the Washington Post fact checker gave this 4 Pinocchios, or they say this claim that the president just said is not supported by facts. So we are glad to see that more reporters are adding that level of scrutiny within their articles.
Hi. Yes, obviously the fact-checking and fake news is really at the forefront of late. I was wondering if fact-checkers have done any analysis over the past decade or so of fact-checking to determine whether or not the proportionality of falsehoods in the facts that are being checked has risen or remained stable or not.
I think that's hard to measure. It's easy to measure in that there are so many more of us fact-checking now. So yes, there are more facts being fact-checked. Yeah, but does that mean that people are saying more untrue things? I think that's hard to isolate and say politicians are increasingly speaking untruths. I do know that politicians are increasingly aware that we exist and more mindful, at least some of them, more mindful, and at least in the US, ahead of a big speech or a big campaign event, we'll get contacted by the spokespeople for that campaign or the staff and say, hey, we know you're going to fact check this, here's our sources, before you fact check, please consider this. And they'll itemize the points that are being made within the speech because they anticipate that we're going to fact check them. So that's a good thing, and more politicians are becoming aware. And there is research that shows now that fact-checking could change people's minds. Whether that means it changes votes, I think that's less clear, but people are paying attention. Of course, there are many more people now who are quick to call us fake news, but I think there is growth in fact-checking. I don't know whether that means people are becoming less accurate.
I just wondered if, whistleblowers contacted the Washington Post from Amazon, the organisation, what percentage or chance would they have of having their story published with the connection? That's the thing that would worry me. So I don't know if anyone from Amazon has ever had their story printed, but that's a concern, really.
Sure. Well, there was the big whistleblower story in the New York Times. I'm not personally aware of whistleblowers who tried to contact the Washington Post, but I do know that the fact that Jeff Bezos owns us does not change our coverage. He is independent of our editorial decisions, and I've never seen our stories being influenced by the fact that we are owned by Jeff Bezos. So if whistleblowers tried to contact, I can't imagine that would be a problem.
As a journalist, I've been really excited to see the media really doing its job within articles and in headlines, basically saying when he lies quite explicitly. But the presupposition of that is that Democrats, that didn't exist before Trump. And I think that that's a real dereliction of duty with the corporate media in the US, is that they didn't apply these stringent standards to the media under Obama or even George W. Bush. And I wondered if you think this new fascination or interest in fact-checking will carry on when we have a Democratic president who isn't as uncouth or obvious in their lies. That's the first question. The second one is, I think one of the main ways that the corporate media changes reality or warps reality for the reader is not always by getting facts or reporting facts that are wrong, it's by ignoring context. And I wondered if you'd ever thought of doing something called censorship by omission or something like that, where by a statement by a politician, for example Donald Rumsfeld, during the build-up to Iraq, was talking about how brutal Saddam Hussein was. And then someone like the Washington Post could then say, well, actually, Donald Rumsfeld left out the fact that he was selling him chemical weapons in the 1980s. Or, it's just on and on. There's many, many ways of lying to people by just leaving stuff out rather than what you say by itself. And I wondered if that's something you've thought about or something that you could move into to really hold politicians to account.
Yeah, good questions. The second one first, yes, I think it's extremely important for us to shed context especially in such an important topic like that. And that is certainly what we try to do. And I think that US outlets and every outlet and journalists in general should be more willing to provide additional context, not just in a fact check, but in news articles. And we kind of see this now with these think pieces or takes or outlets like Vox, where their whole mission is to explain the news, right? So theoretically, they're supposed to explain to you the context that's missing. Of course, sometimes it's from a partisan angle, but I think that now with the internet and with a lot of people putting their own takes and more of this explainer journalism, I wonder what it would have been at that time if there was this type of journalism, explanatory journalism, kind of debunking journalism that we see now. So I do hope that more outlets do it, and I think we have the means to keep doing that now. To your first question, yeah, we'll see what happens with the next president, but Barack Obama remains the most fact-checked politician by the Washington Post fact checker. So throughout his presidency, we missed the first 2 years of his presidency, but we fact-checked throughout the most of his presidency, and he, like I said, he remains our most fact-checked politician. And certainly fact-checking has been around even when he was around. It's just that reading fact checks, like 2 to 3 Pinocchio fact checks about the really nuances of economic policy and why this statistic might have been interpreted in this manner by one economist, that's just not as attention-grabbing as Donald Trump saying that thousands of Muslims saw the World Trade Centers fall. So there is kind of this element of more people are interested in what we're fact-checking with Donald Trump now because it's inherently interesting and it's easier to grasp. A 4 Pinocchio is much easier to grasp than like a 2 to 3 and kind of the nuanced context conversation. And I hope that now that more people are fact checking and making this really obvious, like putting in chyrons on the news, putting it in headlines, that I hope that holds us accountable in the next president, whether he or she is a Democrat or a Republican, because at that point we will have to keep being so outward about fact checking. I think it raises the standard from this point on, because we're so open about fact checking Donald Trump. I think we have to continue to be open about fact checking every politician, and we have been with Barack Obama, but now there's more attention on it. So I hope that people continue to fact check future presidents.
Thank you very much, Michelle. I urge all of you to ask more questions during lunch. Hope you like it too. And
Thank you.